the long-form census is crucial in terms of making decisions based on evidence and based on statistical data. And so the long-form census gave us information on a wide number of issues ranging from poverty reduction measures to urban planning to business decisions made by small and medium-sized enterprises. And so that data was essential in terms of making sure that the government was accountable, that made the government ensuring that the government made decisions not based on ideology, but on real facts. And so the elimination of the long-form census has had disastrous effects. Right now we're seeing the government make decisions really largely in the dark and imposing, by eliminating the long-form census, it was somewhat of an act of willful ignorance in which the government got rid of all this useful information that was so necessary to our democracy. And so we have these cases such as a researcher from Toronto who spent 5 years developing a tool to assess poverty in urban centers. We've seen those projects being mothballed because we no longer have reliable data. And we've seen it with the National Household Survey as well, that it's actually cost us more. It's cost us $22 million more than the former long-form census did. And we're also getting less reliable data. And so this is a complete misuse of taxpayer dollars as well. It's bad management. And we've also seen that in 2011, based on low rates of response, thousands of communities. Statistics Canada was unable to report data on more than 1,000 Canadian communities, which represents actually a quarter of Canadian municipalities, mostly First Nations and rural communities. And so it poses an enormous problem for responsible decision-making in Canada. That's a great question, because as MPs, we're constantly bombarded with so much data coming from different advocacy groups, coming from research groups, think tanks. We're constantly expected to assimilate all this information, and some of this information is increasingly complex when we're talking about things like health regulations or environmental protections. And so that's one reason why my colleague Kennedy Stewart, the critic for science and technology for the official opposition, proposed the creation of a parliamentary science officer. So a strong voice for science in Parliament that would help members of Parliament sift through all this scientific data, and would also make sure that the government is unable to ignore or distort scientific evidence in its decision making. I actually sat on the Environment Committee when the Conservatives actually completely rolled Canadian environmental legislation back decades by amending the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And so we need a robust and a democratic process for environmental assessment in Canada, especially around projects on resource exploitation. We need a robust Canadian environmental assessment process to ensure that there is social license, and also to ensure that these projects are sound and that they aren't detrimental to the environment. So currently we don't have that, thanks to what the changes made by the Conservatives in 2012. And so we need to repair the damage that's been done to Canadian environmental assessment to ensure that we take into account sound environmental advice and that we actually consult Canadians on natural resource projects happening in the communities. Well, as legislators, we're expected to take into account scientific evidence, but as you know, there are also a lot of other factors that we need to take into account, such as, for example, fiscal constraints, public opinions, other stakeholders, etc. And so I think part of that is also increasing scientific literacy among Canadians, so ensuring that scientists can talk to Canadians about their findings and that there's a communication between scientists and the general public. And so I think, first of all, increasing awareness and education among Canadians is important. But I also think that the government needs to be held accountable if it chooses to ignore or skew scientific evidence. And we've seen this in the case of the Environment Minister, who chose to ignore scientific evidence when it came to belugas in the St. Lawrence, and also when it came to protecting endangered species on the South Shore of Montreal. And so I think the government needs to be held accountable in those cases when it chooses to willingly ignore scientific evidence. Well, in 2008, we did have a chief scientific advisor. The office was eliminated in 2008, and unfortunately has not been reinstated since. What we propose is actually a more robust parliamentary science officer that's actually based on a current parliamentary budget officer. And so this position, or the person filling this position, would be a strong voice for science in Parliament, would offer scientific advice to Cabinet, to the Prime Minister, and to members of Parliament, but would also play an oversight role. So would be able to audit, for example, our science spending, would be able to evaluate if science has been taken into account in decision making, and evaluate cases in which scientific evidence isn't present when it comes to decision making. So this the office that we propose to create would both be a watchdog as well as an advisor. Scientists play such an important role in helping parliamentarians make their decisions, especially scientists working for the federal government. So one thing we certainly need to address immediately is the muzzling of Canadian scientists. Right now, scientists have to pass through various levels of bureaucrats before they're able to talk to the media, before they're able to share the findings of their research, and this poses a problem. The fact that there's no, right now the government has put into place a barrier in scientific communication and eroded scientific integrity. So I think muzzling scientists is the first step, and also building on that relationship, or rebuilding that relationship of trust between federal scientists and Parliament is also extremely important. Well, we need to invest in all types of research. So this includes applied research, but also basic science. It's important to support both kinds of research because we don't know what discoveries that are basic or blue sky science discoveries today, which of these discoveries will be turned into groundbreaking applied uses later on in the future. And so that's an important part of our scientific heritage in terms of supporting basic science. But we also have to realize that innovative research happens in universities, in businesses, but also in colleges as well. And I've been visited a few colleges across Canada, and they have really innovative projects in terms of matching students and their research with local businesses or local organizations to solve real-life problems. And so we need to support research across Canada, but that also includes supporting all kinds of institutions. Well, we're supporters of programs like MyTax, which match students with companies. And we need to make sure that our current students can compete with the best around the world, and that we're internationally competitive. And so providing access to internships is definitely an important piece of that. Well, we've seen cuts in the past few years to the Tri-Council, and that has had an enormous impact on research. Of course, we're interested in diversifying, supporting important research-intensive industries such as the manufacturing industry, aerospace. That's really important in my riding on the North Shore of Montreal. Also, Thomas Mulcair, leader of the NDP, has mentioned his support for the green tech sector and green technology, which is a growing industry in Canada, and we risk really missing out on those global opportunities if we fail to fund this industry and to fund research behind this. And so I think it's important to allow researchers to decide what should be funded, and to put money into these growing industries, and these industries are so important to the province of Quebec as well. Well, science is global, and so we know that international collaborations are essential. We've unfortunately seen our international reputation eroded, especially around the issue of muzzling. So last year we saw more than 800 international scientists write into Stephen Harper to say, you got to stop muzzling your scientists because it's hurting our capacity for international collaborations. So that's one thing that we need to address when we talk about working with scientists across the world. But I think that our cuts to science in Canada have also had an impact on our international collaborations, especially the effect that cuts have had on research in the North. There are many examples, but I can think of one example of, for example, ice core samples that were put into jeopardy due to cuts to NRCan, ice core samples that represent 40 years of research by government scientists. And this is data that's used around the world. So really protecting the integrity of our scientific institutions is important in ensuring that we can be a strong international collaborator. Well, we need to, as I mentioned, invest in green tech, which is already a $10 billion industry, so it's not negligible. And universities certainly play a large role in that in terms of diversifying our economy, and also finding solutions in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think the green technology industry needs support that it hasn't been getting, and we've heard this when they come in to testify in committee. In my running of Rivière-des-Mille-Îles, I have a company called Novabus, and they produce hybrid buses. And they have contracts around the world, and this is really innovative technology. But when we have great companies like Novabus, it also creates business for all these smaller companies around it that provide services or components of the larger product. And so it really is an ecosystem, and in order to have a healthy green tech ecosystem, we need to support these technologies and these local job creators as well. Well, part of it comes with supporting university research. I know that a lot of important work is being done on this in universities across Canada. We need to ensure that we support our research infrastructure. I've also asked the government many times to support the indirect costs of research, to make sure that we have the money to keep the lights on in our laboratories and support ongoing research. So those are all pieces of ensuring that we have the means to develop excellence in this field and also in other fields. We need to, again, invest in the green tech industry. We also need to participate in global negotiations around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I was in Durban when right before Canada pulled out of Kyoto, and I was, following Peter Kent around in Durban, South Africa, while he was at the conference, and it was really surprising to see delegates who would actually come up to me, knowing that I was a Canadian member of Parliament, and say, Canada has really changed, in the past decade, and the reputation of Canada abroad has really changed. So we've gone from being an honest negotiator, a leader, and a country that can really put forward best practices, to being a country that, when it pulled out of Kyoto, actually negotiated in bad faith with the international community, and so we lost a lot of support, especially around that incident. And it was actually really surprising the way the government chose to pull us out of Kyoto, when he wouldn't actually even let Peter Kent go home after getting off the plane before he had the press conference to announce that Canada was pulling out. And this was only a few days before Christmas. So we definitely need to change Canada's international reputation when it comes to talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to take responsibility for reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions. Well, in my writing that's in the Lower Laurentians, I do have a population that is increasingly aging. There are lots of seniors, and we're also, healthcare is also very underfunded, so about half of my constituents don't have access to a family doctor. So it's a major concern. And recently I've held some public assemblies in my writing to talk about the importance of putting into place a national healthcare strategy. So the importance of ensuring that palliative care, long-term care, and home care are accessible to all Canadians, no matter where they live. So that's a major concern. Also recently in the House of Commons, Claude Cravel tabled a national strategy on dementia. These are increasingly issues that my constituents and Canadians are talking about. They need to have robust research programs in place to look at dementia that affects all Canadians. So those are some issues we need to look at. The government has also announced that it'll be cutting $36 billion in transfers in healthcare to the provinces over the next 10 years. And so Thomas Mulcair, the leader of the NDP, has announced that he will reverse those cuts when the NDP forms government. Well, the federal government needs to be a partner, and it needs to, in terms of the transfers of funding to provinces, we need to make sure that our healthcare system is properly funded. In terms of specifically with respect to science and technology, I think the federal government has a leadership role to play in terms of making sure that we have robust research programs in place around dementia, as I mentioned, but also around other important health issues, such as eating disorders, which is an issue that I've been working on recently. Well, we need to look at research, properly funding research into mental health initiatives and into mental health research. So specifically speaking on the issue of eating disorders, currently the wait times for receiving treatments for eating disorders can be from 3 to 6 months. And these are for really crucial cases. So we see that access to eating disorders is in no way equal across the country. It's not just people living in rural or faraway communities that have trouble accessing treatment for eating disorders, but also people living in urban centers such as Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And we currently lack data in terms of treatment for eating disorders, so we currently need to do more research into looking into how eating disorders affects women and girls, but also LGBT people, and also First Nations people, minorities, etc. And we need this research in order to adequately address and provide treatment in Canada. Well, the Conservative government has a failed plan on science and technology, and we've seen it, the effects of that plan over the past 9 years. We've spent, in the 41st Parliament, the NDP has spent a lot of time developing a concrete plan to fix the damage caused by Conservatives. And we've always been front and center in the 41st Parliament in terms of tabling legislation. So Kennedy Stewart was actually the first to table legislation in the House to create a parliamentary science officer. And Brian Massey's bill, tabled in the House of Commons to reinstall the long-form census, is actually the most robust and comprehensive legislation we've seen on the long-form census in the 41st Parliament. And so we have a concrete plan, and honestly, the Liberals aren't ready yet to fix damage caused by Stephen Harper. We also know that under the Liberal government in the 90s, there were cuts to science and technology, including to the Tri-Council. So we have a plan to reinvest in science and technology in Canada, and Thomas Mulcair also understands the importance of supporting research in Canada.